We are at the start of a sermon series that we're calling I Am. As we're looking at this series, what we're doing is we're looking together at the attributes of God. And so we said at the beginning of this school year that for the rest of the school year, what we'd be doing is we'd have a theme called Equip the Saints for Ministry. And as part of that focus for that year ahead of us, we have 4 different seasons that we're walking through, 4 different things that we are emphasizing in each season. And so the fall season, and it's on the front of your program as well, the fall season is a time where we are spending an emphasis on the gospel of Christ. As part of that, we said we want to look at this passage in Hebrews to lay out sort of our expectations and the foundation or the framework for what it is that we're going through. And so the gospel of Christ will deal particularly with repentance from acts that lead to death, which is a long phrase for the word sin, and then faith in God. And so during this series, as we talk about I Am, one of the things that we're asking ourselves to do as a congregation is to look at the God that we have faith in. Who is this God and what is He like? So do me a favor for a moment. Raise your hand if you have made it down to Brazos Bend State Park. Yeah. All right. Now, show of hands, for those of you that didn't feel like participating before, raise your hand if you've made it down to Brazos Bend State Park. Yeah, same question. We're doing it again. All right. So I took my kids last year, Valerie and I, and we have 4 boys. We have, at the time, they would have been 8, 6, 4, and 2. We're closer to 1. And the 1-year-old, we'd put in a stroller and we'd push around, and from time to time, he'd want to get out and run around. But 4 boys, sometimes, well, they're wild, and they're boys, and they're filled with testosterone. I have to be careful, because sometimes they listen to the sermon. They're precious and sweet and so well behaved. So we're at Brazos Bend State Park, and we hear that there are alligators there. We've never gone before, so we don't know fully what to expect. We go on a long walk. It's hot out. We haven't seen anything. We climb this 3 or 4-story tower where you get a good look at the park. And we spend 20 minutes on this tower looking for alligators and thinking to ourselves, is that a log? Is that moving? Is that an alligator? And then eventually some people come walking by and they say, hey, have you been down the path yet? There are alligators all over the place. And we're like, oh, okay, let's go for a walk. So we get down, we head down this paved pathway. And sure enough, on the shoulder of the path are alligators. If you had a stick, not a long stick, if you had just your average size stick, you could poke one. And so I take my kids to the side and I say, listen, boys, when an alligator looks at you, he doesn't see what I see. I need you to know this. When an alligator looks at you, he sees a chicken nugget. The way that you feel when you see a chicken nugget is how that alligator feels when he looks at you. Am I making myself clear? I want to get into their heads because they don't have that situational awareness. Man, they're hardly ever aware of their surroundings. And I know even when alligators are right next to us, there will be times where they wander away or roughhouse or do things they're not supposed to. So I'm trying to put the fear of the alligator in them. I heard a pastor talking once about a trip he took to the zoo. And he shared that he was there with his grandchildren. He couldn't wait to get to the big cats area to show his grandchildren, man, tigers and cougars, and then eventually a lion, and the power of a lion. But the problem is when you get to that part of the zoo, it's not actually a problem, right? But there's a giant pane of glass. That sucker is thick that keeps you safe from that lion. And what often happens is you'll get there and you'll see the lion and it'll be fun at first. And if you're a child, you're thinking, how do I get this thing to growl? How do I get this thing to roar? All it's doing is slowly pacing back and forth. I want to see some action. And so whenever you go to the zoo, in particular the big cat area, and you make your way to the lion exhibit, there are usually children teasing the lion on the other side of the glass. And I wonder how many of us have a God that is more like a lion on the other side of the glass. I mean, you get used to your God being contained. You get used to your God being predictable. You get used to your God being what you would consider safe. It is almost as if you know that there's a God, but He's on the other side of the glass. You get to be a spectator. You know facts and information about your God. You can stand in a safe area and you can read what has been written about Him, just like the children do with the lions. You'll know how much the lion weighs. You'll know how much pounds of pressure its bite can give. You'll know the lion's diet. You'll know the lifespan of the lion. In a sense, you know the ferocity of the lion. I want to avoid this when it comes to a message about the attributes of God. I want to avoid it feeling like we know about the lion on the other side of the glass. Like we can talk about how dangerous it is. Sometimes when men go to a zoo, they don't say this out loud, but what they're thinking as they pass by the exhibit is, I wonder if I could take that animal. I mean, even when you're at Brazos Bend State Park, you go, okay, now if things went south, how would I handle this? You're strategizing in your mind how you'll get on top of the alligator and get behind it. And I bet there are men in this room that have plans to go for the eyeballs. Now, when you go to a zoo, you might be thinking the same thing about the lion on the other side of the glass. The lion is not thinking the same thing about you. He knows that if you get on the other side of that glass, it's game over. Abraham, as I read the scriptures, has a God without thick glass between him. His life gets interrupted one day by the God of the universe. Only Abraham does not have scriptures or theology books that he can read about this God. All he knows is that he's come into the presence of powerful God, and it feels unpredictable to him. What is this God like? And what will He do to me if I don't listen? And what will His response be if I get it wrong? And what can this God do for me? And how powerful is this God? There's so much that I don't know. And so God will tell Abraham to leave his family and leave his land and everything he knows. And Abraham will pack his bags and he will go because he's on the other side of the glass. He's there with the lion, so to speak. He's there with his God. Oh man, and he knows, I don't want to be on this God's bad side. Abraham will be told by this God to cut animals into pieces and put them on opposite sides of each other. And so he does. And when he does, he falls into a deep supernatural sleep. And when he does, God is there, something like a smoking fire pot, moving between the pieces, making promises to Abraham, making a deal, covenanting himself to Abraham, and not expecting anything of Abraham in return. And Abraham must be thinking, who is this guy? What is he like? What is he capable of? What else is going to happen to me? In a way, it feels like he's just along for the ride. Okay, God, you're calling the shots. God will tell him that he'll have children and descendants more numerous than the stars. Only Abraham knows that his wife cannot conceive, and they're both in their old age, and so his wife will laugh, and they'll name their child Isaac, laughter. This child of supernatural, miraculous birth. And then Abraham will have a conversation with this God, both of them standing together on the other side of the glass, if you will, and God will say to Abraham, take your son, your only son, whom you love, who I gave to you, Isaac, and sacrifice him to me. And Abraham won't know any better. There's no information to go off of, so he says, okay, because there is power that is with Abraham like none other than he's ever met before. So he'll do it. He'll take Isaac up on the mountain, and God will say, wait a minute. And he'll show him a bull caught in the thicket, a ram caught by its horns, and he'll tell Abraham to sacrifice it instead of his son. Abraham, in his old age, his servant will tell him that he'll find a bride for his son Isaac. His servant knows this God of the universe well enough to know that he should consult with him first. And so he says, God, I need to find a wife for my master's son. If you have somebody in mind for him, make it obvious. And so the Lord shows the servant Rebekah. And Rebekah ends up marrying Isaac. Together they have Jacob and Esau. Jacob will discover this same God is a God that will wrestle with you. And so in the middle of the night in his tent one day, the Lord comes to him and wrestles with him all night long, eventually wrenching his hip out of his socket. Jacob is learning things about this God. He's with this God on the other side of the glass. Story after story of this incredible force who's also personal, this divine being, and the encounters that the fathers of the faith are having with them. Eventually, Jacob will have a son named Joseph. He'll have many children. His children will be jealous of the way that he seems to love and favor Joseph. And through a series of events, his brothers, Joseph's siblings, they'll try to kill him. And then they'll change their minds and they'll sell him off into slavery. And then unfortunate turn of events after unfortunate turn of events leads Joseph into prison in Egypt. There, Joseph will gain a reputation for interpreting dreams. As he does, he'll make it clear, I don't know anything about your dreams. All I know is to ask God what you're dreaming about and to tell you what he says to me. And so one day Pharaoh has a disturbing pair of dreams. And he cannot get any of his false prophets to tell him what the dream means. And so one day the cupbearer to Pharaoh says, "Oh, you'll have to forgive me. I remember, Pharaoh, you have somebody in your prison that can interpret dreams. Must have slipped my mind." So Pharaoh consults with Joseph in prison. Joseph interprets the dreams like God tells him, and then Pharaoh puts him in charge of all of Egypt. He says, "You have all the power I have, only I have power over you. But you can do anything that Pharaoh can do," and puts him in charge of the stores of grain for all of Egypt. Through a series of events, Joseph's family is spared from a famine, moves down to Egypt to an area called Goshen, which is for shepherds. And if you're watching this story unfold, then what you learn about the God of the universe as you're standing on the other side of the glass there with him is that he is in charge of the chessboard. It is like life is a chessboard, but there's one player, Yahweh, and he is on both sides of it, moving the pieces, and yet the pieces seem to have free will, and they sin and they disobey, and yet nothing is happening outside of God's permission and outside of his control. Somehow both this God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob is in full control, even when everybody in the world is spiraling out of control. So the Israelites start to flourish there in Egypt. They start to multiply, they start to grow, their flocks get numerous, but as a people, they get numerous. The Egyptians start to notice the Israelites are outnumbering us. And eventually, if we don't do something now, then the Israelites will soon be the ones in charge of Egypt. And so Pharaoh and the Egyptians, years later, as they have forgotten Joseph, as they have long forgotten how Israel came to be there, nor do they care, nor do they think they owe anyone anything, they decide to enslave the Israelites. Well, this doesn't matter if you're an Israelite, because you know that your God is in control. You know there is none like him, and so you pray. But then a day goes by, and you're still enslaved. So you keep praying. And then days turn into weeks, weeks turn into months, months turn into years, and you keep praying. And eventually years turn into 400 years of slavery. By this time, you share stories of the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but you don't know him. When you talk about him, it's like reading facts at a zoo about a lion on the other side of the glass. You can talk about his power and his ferocity, but you've never seen it. You've never experienced it. You wouldn't know what it was like to be there with him. You just pretend that he's around. And then Moses is born. It feels like things are going from bad to worse. Moses eventually finds himself in the wilderness, and there he sees a bush on fire. Only the bush is not being consumed. It's not burning. And so he goes to investigate. And the God who has been silent for 400 years, the first thing out of his mouth is, "Don't come any closer." It is not touchy-feely. It is not, "Oh, how I have missed you. Oh, how I have loved you. Oh, how much I have longed to see you." It is, "You do not understand the power before you. Buddy, you have found yourself on the other side of the glass. Don't come any closer." Theologians will talk about the attributes of God. We'll categorize them. We'll talk about His primary attributes, those things that you would know about God apart from creation. That God is one, that God is uncreated, that God is from self, a word we call aseity. We would talk about His relational attributes, the things that we know about God because of creation, that God is all-powerful, that God is eternal, He stands outside of time, that God is all-knowing, that God is all-present. And then we would talk about His interpersonal attributes, the things that we can know about God not only because He created, but because He created mankind, that God is incomparably personal is one of them, that God is not only transcendent, but He is immanent is another of them. And then because God created mankind to have free will, we can speak of His moral attributes. We know that God is holy. We know that God is love. And sometimes we get into the habit of thinking about our God in a scholarly way. And we can start to feel like we're on the other side of the glass. To a certain extent, I think we are. I think because of the grace of God, if there is any separation at all, it is because God's grace has made it so. That one day there will be no separation at all. He will come again to judge the living and the dead. A.W. Tozer puts it this way: the only refuge you have from God is found in God. And what we find is that God gives us all that we need in Him. Let me turn our attention to a moment to Isaiah chapter 46, verses 3 to 10. God will focus here on what theologians call the oneness of God. The hero Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one. There is none other like Him. He will say this: listen to me, you descendants of Jacob, all the remnant of the people of Israel, you whom I have upheld since your birth and carried you since you were born. Church, will you listen to this? The Lord has upheld you since your birth. He has carried you since you were born, even to your old age and your gray hairs. I am He who will sustain you. I have made you, and I will carry you. I will sustain you, and I will rescue you. And what we need to know this morning is that there is one God, and He is the God who made you. No one else made you. No one else created you. No one else sustains you. No one else can save you. No one else knows you. There is one God. He knows all of you. He's been with you every moment of your life. You have not had a minute in your life in which God was not present with you. The lowest, darkest moments of your life, God was with you. He was not truly on the other side of the glass. A power and a force like none other. And when I say that He knows you, I mean He knows you more than your wife knows you, more than your kids know you, more than the people that changed your diaper knows you, more than your grandparents know you. He knows you. He knows you more than you know yourself. He knows your secrets. He knows your innermost thoughts. He knows your desires. He knows your hopes, your dreams, your anxieties, your concerns. And He says, I alone am the one that holds you. I alone am the one who can save you. And He goes on to say, with whom will you compare me or count me equal? To whom will you liken me that we may be compared? Some pour out gold from their bags and weigh out silver on the scales. They hire a goldsmith to make it into a god. They bow down and worship it. They lift it to their shoulders and carry it. They set it up in its place, and there it stands. From that spot it cannot move. Even though someone cries out to it, it cannot answer. It cannot save them from their troubles. So God says to us, not only is there one and one alone who created you and sustains you and can save you, but there is one and one alone who is worthy of your worship, who is worthy of your devotion, who is worthy to be the center of your life and your life's pursuits. There is none other. Remember this. Keep it in mind. Take it to heart, you rebels. Remember the former things, those of long ago. I am God and there is no other. I am God and there is none like me. I make known the end from the beginning, from ancient times what is still to come. I say, my purpose will stand, and I will do what I please. There is one God. One God who made you, one God who knows you, one God who saves you. There is one God that is worthy of your devotion, worthy of your worship, and there is one being in this universe who will have His way, one whose purposes will stand, one whose will take place. Do not listen, church, to the world that tells you that answers will be found elsewhere. That if you will only purchase this, that if you will only procure this, that if you will only build your life on this, that if you will only vote for this party, and that if only this party were in control. Do not listen, church. There is one God, and He is in control, and His purposes will stand. And you are always on the other side of the glass. Let us pray.